Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Yes, I have decided to continue doing these into 2026 because they just bring in so much views, much more than I was getting before. So I think honestly I should be doing these again, and I will be doing it in 2026 as well. So for the very first fact of 2026, I'm going to bring it off with a very dark note because when President Garfield was shot, the doctors didn't exactly do the greatest job in doctor history. They made James Garfield lose over 80 pounds in just 3 months before eventually killing him in September. And he was shot in July. So very, very unfortunate stuff for Garfield. Wait, no, that's 2 months. Okay, 2 months. Not 3 months. 2 months. He lost 80 pounds, which is much worse. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The very first president of the United States was George Washington, and he was a lot of things, like the first president, but he was also previously a ginger. Now, he didn't die as a ginger, so when you're saying that you hate gingers, you might be saying that you hate George Washington as well. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, a couple days ago, Donald Trump, I don't know if he necessarily invaded, but he definitely stole the president of Venezuela and essentially getting the U.S. into another war with Venezuela. But it's very interesting, actually, because he legitimately opposed the war of Iraq initially. He was, from day one, against the war in Iraq when most people were in for it because of all the lies going on. But yes, it's very interesting to see him oppose Iraq and go into Venezuela. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Back in the 1700s, two men sharing a bed wouldn't be seen as, how it would be seen as today, but it would be more seen as, normal. When you're going abroad, you don't exactly have two beds, so you share the bed. And that's what John Adams did when he went to Paris with Benjamin Franklin. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. When he was just serving as the 22nd president, we didn't know he would become 24th, but when he was 22nd president, Grover Cleveland started actually his term single and lifelong single because he wasn't married. He would eventually marry while serving as president, but initially he didn't have a wife. So First Lady was his sister. And that actually means that for a time in American history, the First Lady was either lesbian or bisexual because Grover Cleveland's sister was not married because it wasn't allowed back then, but in a relationship with another woman. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Back in the 1970s, Richard Nixon was president of the United States, at least in the first 4 years of which, the 1970s, he was president. During this time, Chile had a democratically elected president who identified as a socialist. So, yeah, the United States obviously didn't really like that. So they went in there and they sponsored a coup to overthrow the democratically elected president of Chile. And what did Richard Nixon have to say about this? Make the economy scream. Which just goes to demonstrate how the United States has never cared about the people living in other countries, just about their own interests. Hello, I'm Dezod500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, liked to collect fossils. Now, since dinosaurs weren't exactly found until a couple years before his death, I don't know what type of fossils he was collecting, but yeah, it's very interesting that an actual president collected. Hello, this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, the 31st president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, was not always the president. In fact, let me fix my hair actually. He was a miner, and he mined in China. And of course, when you live so far away, and you live there for a long time, you have to pick up on their language, especially since no Chinese person in the 19th century was learning English, right? So, what are you going to do? You're going to learn Mandarin. So Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou did learn Mandarin and actually spoke it even in America when they were on eavesdroppers on their conversation. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, first off, I do want to apologize for yesterday's audio. I think I accidentally left my headphones jack in there when I was recording. So, of course, the audio came out a little weird. But today, hopefully it's fixed. And I would like to talk about how Gerald Ford, we all know that he came to become president off very weird and unusual circumstances. But he actually was intending to not even become president or even stick around long enough, because he was planning to retire from the House of Representatives in 1976. Of course, though, he had other plans, or God had other plans, and he made Ford vice president and then president. So that's very interesting. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Nowadays, when we try to make fun of politicians, we just say something embarrassing that they said, because on both sides now, there's a lot of embarrassing things being said in American politics. But all the way back, at least in the 70s, we were still making cartoons. And one of the ways that the cartoonists would make a joke at the president would be to exaggerate a feature that is, typically long on the face, and that's not typically long on other faces. But Gerald Ford had features so nondescript, the cartoonist didn't know what to exaggerate. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, was not just the 5th President of the United States. He was also Secretary of War and Secretary of State, both at the same time, under President James Madison. In fact, he's the only person in American history to hold 2 secretary positions at the same time. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, back in the day, Richard Nixon was offered a scholarship for Harvard. Yes, the Harvard, the school that everyone wants to go to. Nixon was offered a scholarship, which was it's absolutely insane to be offered a scholarship, especially for Harvard. But he actually had to turn it down. Why did he turn it down? Well, because he was too poor. He couldn't go there. Because he lived in California, and Harvard's all the way on the East Coast, so couldn't necessarily get there with easily. So yeah, he didn't have enough money to do that. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. The 3rd President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, was known to actually be quite an introvert. In fact, he only gave 2 public speeches his entire presidency of 8 years, which were his inaugural addresses. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Just over a decade after the Civil War ended, Rutherford Hayes, the 19th President of the United States, appointed Frederick Douglass as Marshal of Washington, D.C., the very first African-American appointment in American history. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 4th President of the United States, James Madison, strongly believed that the United States of America should not have an official state religion. And he believed this so hard that Virginia, the state of Virginia, tried to make Christianity the official religion of just the state. And Madison, a resident of Virginia, pushed so firmly against this just by himself that Virginia just stopped, and they did. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. President William Howard Taft had not really wanted to be president. I mean, he clearly did in 1908 when he ran, but before that, his goal wasn't to become president of the United States, but rather to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a goal that he later did accomplish. In fact, he swore in my favorite president, Calvin Coolidge, and my not-so-favorite president, Herbert Hoover. Hello, I'm Desad 500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, the goated president of the United States, the 30th Calvin Coolidge, who is my favorite president, loved to eat breakfast in bed, and not just on special occasions. When he was president, he liked to eat breakfast in bed all the time. And you know what? I can't even blame him. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, by the time you're seeing this, I am probably writing my Spanish exam. I'm not very happy. No contento. I want to bring up Spain because I'm writing a Spanish exam, so I got to do a fact about Spain. And William McKinley, the 25th United States president, had declared war on Spain because he wanted to expand the United States borders. He was the very first real expansionist American president, with many, many more to come. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, today here in Toronto, it is expected to reach minus 50 degrees Celsius, and that is insanely cold. I don't know how I'm gonna survive and how I'm gonna do this for tomorrow. But anyways, minus 50, wow. So I brought this up because I want to bring up something cold, which is Alaska. Alaska's pretty cold. And Andrew Johnson knew that when he was buying Alaska, and a lot of people who didn't want him to buy Alaska also knew this, and thus they called it Mr. Johnson's Icebox, and that's pretty cool. Another nickname is even cooler: President Johnson's Polar Bear Paradise. Man, that makes me want to sound like I want to go there now. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. 34th President of the United States, Harry Truman, served after the 33rd President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, because that's how that works. Franklin Roosevelt had actually served for 4 terms, and usually presidents only serve for 2 terms. So they were like, yo, my guy, we're not going to let you do this anymore. So they didn't let him do it anymore. And they created a constitutional amendment to say, from now on, presidents are only going to serve for 2 terms, with one exception, that being Harry Truman. Because he was in office when that amendment was passed, they allowed Truman to have the opportunity to serve a 3rd term, but he denied. He said, no, I'm not going to do this, because nobody liked him. Nobody liked Harry Truman. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, yesterday, here in the city of Toronto, we had the snowiest day in our history. 56 centimeters of snow just dumped on our city, which is probably not comparable to what Hawaii got, because Hawaii probably didn't get any snow. Hawaii is part of the United States because it was annexed by a coup that overthrew their queen. And this coup was in large part orchestrated by President McKinley and the United States. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, as you're seeing this, I'm probably writing my science exam, and I'm not very excited for that. I currently only have a 71% in that course, so I low-key have to do well in this exam. But anyways, one of the professions that is synonymous with the sciences is doctor, and everyone needs a doctor. President James Garfield definitely needed a doctor when he got shot in the back. However, his doctors ended up killing him. But if he had today's doctors, he would have survived, and he would have been president at least 4 more years. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, many presidents of the United States have had insanely weird and unusual pets, and one of them has definitely been John Quincy Adams. We already touched up on his alligator back a couple months ago, but he also had silkworms as a pet in the White House, which I can't stand any type of insects, but I guess John Quincy Adams could. Hello, I'm Dazad500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. By the time of his death at 90 years old in October 1964, Herbert Hoover was the 2nd longest lived president in American history, only being beat out by John Adams, who was just a couple months, well, like 10 months older, 8 months older when he died. So not necessarily a couple months, but 90 years old you can live another 8 months. But anyways, Herbert Hoover lived so long that he was theoretically able to have met every single president from Andrew Johnson all the way to today, to the modern day, because he lived from 1874 to 1964. And by 1964, all of the presidents that have currently served had been born. And by 1874, Andrew Johnson was the earliest president still alive. He would die the next year. So from 1809 to the modern day, he could have met every single president. Hello, I'm Dadzot500, and this is your presidential fact of the day. Well, if you know literally anything about American history, at the start of it, the United States and the United Kingdom weren't the best of friends. But when you low-key have to fight a war together, you do get a little bit closer. So the United States presidents have not visited the United Kingdom for over 100 years since it started, but in sometime after World War I started, I'm not sure, Woodrow Wilson had to visit the United Kingdom because they're fighting a war with them. So he went to the United Kingdom, and he became the very first American president to go to the United Kingdom.